Welcome to the Football Debates Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Debates. In this special edition, we are going to look at the 2026 NFL Draft, do our own little recap of it, looking at each of the teams, not all the picks by every team, but some of the picks by every team in the NFL. We're going to talk about some of the picks that I agree with, some that I disagree with, kind of questioning some teams as to why they drafted one player over another, and just look at my opinions on various players that I'm going to pay attention to in the upcoming season. One thing that I'm not going to do is I'm not going to grade the draft. I don't think that makes sense. It will be some time before we know whether these draft classes actually work out or not. Players may not fit the system, or if a team drafts a player this year and then fires the head coach, they may not fit the new coach's system. Plus, nearly every draft, about half the teams get A grades, a bunch get B grades, and if a team has a bad draft according to the experts, they'll give them C grades. Nobody really ever gets a D or an F grade very often on the drafts. It does happen, but not very often. If all these teams aced their draft or got an A+ draft or an A grade on their draft year after year, then a lot of these teams should be playing for the Super Bowl every year. And we should see a higher turnover in the number of teams that make the playoffs, because a bad team can potentially become a great team if they have a great draft. Well, that isn't always the case. So the draft grades to me don't mean anything. It's more of what the quote-unquote experts think, and I don't agree with them a lot of the times either. But we are going to take this team by team. We're going to go alphabetical order. I'm going to use the ESPN draft tracker. I like how they use their tracker. They list every team's draft pick with a little write-up on most, if not all, the players. But they also have a needs area at the top of the draft, and they highlight it when a team drafts a player at a position of need, and it stays shaded as if they don't draft a player from that area. But there is a caveat to that. Sometimes, for example, an offensive tackle in college projects to be a guard at the NFL level, and the ESPN tracker will highlight the offensive tackle need, but not necessarily the guard need. So we'll talk about a little bit of that, because that happened a couple of cases here in this year's draft. So to start, we're going to begin with the Arizona Cardinals, who drafted the number 3 player in the draft, or had the 3rd pick in the draft, and potentially some people believed was the best player in the draft, a running back, Jeremiah Love out of Notre Dame. They had several other needs. They had an offensive tackle need that they could have gotten one of the better offensive tackles at the number 3 pick. However, I do kind of like this pick from the fact that they have a very good tight end who's become one of the better ones in the NFL. They have a wide receiver whose dad is a Hall of Famer, and they're looking to unlock his potential. So now by having a good running back, now you force the defense to try to figure out who they should defend, the running back, the quarterback, or the running back, the tight end, or the wide receiver. They got one of the better guards in the draft in the 2nd round, and I apologize if I mispronounce any of these names. Chase Besantis. A lot of people had him as a low 1st round grade. They got him the 2nd pick of the 2nd round. And then they drafted Carson Beck out of Miami. He is a quarterback who won a national championship at Georgia, got injured in the playoffs, transferred to Miami, and nearly took Miami to the national championship game. He's kind of hit and miss, up and down quarterback. 3rd round pick, not too bad. But if the Cardinals can find their quarterback of the future, next year's draft, all of the quote-unquote experts are saying should be a great quarterback draft. If they can find their quarterback this year and they draft high next year, maybe they can trade back, pick up some additional picks, and get more players. They had a 4th round pick, Caleb Proctor out of Southeast Louisiana. He scored points with a lot of NFL players, or a lot of NFL teams, as a player that stayed at his school, didn't take the NIL money to go to bigger schools, and he was a disruptive force on a not great team, but he was a good player, similar type of player to Hall of Famer Aaron Donald. I'm not saying he's going to become a Hall of Famer, but he's a similar type of player to Donald. So those are some of the picks that I like for Arizona. The next team is Atlanta, who, according to ESPN's needs, they hit all of their needs. They drafted a cornerback in the second round with their first pick, whose brother is a corner for the Falcons already. They drafted a wide receiver out of Georgia in the third round, Zachariah Branch, who many NFL experts, many NFL scouts and executives thought that Georgia didn't use Branch correctly. They used him mostly on short routes and then let him run, kind of like a returner, as opposed to more of a downfield receiver. Not a bad pick. I think he can be an explosive player in the right circumstances if they give him the ball in space. They had a pick in the sixth round, Harold Perkins Jr., a linebacker out of LSU. Some people originally had him going as high as the third or fourth round. Atlanta got him in the sixth. He's a good player, not exactly sure why he fell, but sometimes that just happens in the draft. Next team is the Baltimore Ravens. Their first round pick, Vega Ione, the guard from Penn State. Really good player, a great team fit. He fits the mentality of the Baltimore Ravens that they've had for the last 30 years. Big physical player, and from a lot of accounts, a really good young man. There's video out there of after a Penn State game, I believe it might even been a loss. The team was walking back to the locker room, and there was a staffer who was pushing a heavy equipment cart along, and Ione hops a guardrail for a big offensive lineman. He's 6'4", 320. Hops it like it's nothing, and then goes and helps the staffer push the equipment cart up the ramp that they're trying to go up. That's the type of player that I would like on my team, not just being a good football player. They also got a wide receiver out of USC, Jacoby Lane, and another one in the fourth round, Elijah Surratt out of Indiana. I'm a big fan of getting players from national championship teams or teams that went deep into the college postseason. Two good wide receivers there to enhance their wide receiver room, which has always been kind of down and always seems to kind of struggle. If they can enhance their wide receiver room, spread out the field a little bit more, give more room for Derrick Henry. They drafted a tight end out of SMU in the fourth round and another one out of Alabama in the fifth. Matthew Hibner out of SMU in the fourth round. It's a little bit more of a receiving tight end. They lost one in free agency, so I like that pick. Matches it up with them. And then a player that I hope makes a roster, and I'm going to try and keep my eye on him if he does end up making the roster, is Evan Biernston. He is an offensive guard out of Northwestern who started his career at South Dakota State, played most of his career at SDSU. As I mentioned before, these are the types of players that I like to follow and watch if they're playing. So we'll see if he can make the Ravens roster as a guard. Next is Buffalo. One of the picks that I really like for them is in the fourth round. They got a wide receiver out of UConn, Skylar Bell. 5'11", 192, really dynamic receiver, very underrated. And I think that he is going to be a nice addition to Buffalo's receiver group. And then they got a defensive tackle out of Penn State, Zane Durant, that can fill some lanes. He's 6'1", 290, a little bit smaller on the defensive tackle side, but he kind of fits their scheme really well. So I think that he might be a nice addition to Buffalo. Next, we have the Carolina Panthers drafting a guard an offensive tackle out of Georgia in the first round, Monroe Freeling. A lot of NFL people said that he's a little bit raw yet with only one season of starting college experience. I'm fine with that because they said that he can play both tackle spots. Carolina's getting a little bit older on the left tackle side. They still have a starter there. But if he can develop for a year, be a solid backup, participate on special teams like the field goal unit, field goal block unit, if he can help out there, get some development, and take over in the future, Chris Brazzell, the second, wide receiver out of Tennessee. Tall wide receiver, can be a deep threat, and will hopefully for Carolina, he'll open up the field a little bit for last year's first-round pick, wide receiver out of Arizona, T-Mac. I can't say his first name, but his last name is McMillan. A center out of Kansas State, Sam Heck, one of my favorite players of the draft. He'll be nice as a reserve lineman and potentially could be a center to work well with Bryce Young, but I like that pick also. Next, we have the Chicago Bears, who I think got one of the steals of the draft at the expense of a division rival, and we'll talk about that more when we get to Minnesota. But Dylan Thieneman, a safety out of Oregon, definitely one of my favorite players out of the draft. I really like the safety positions in whatever team, and Thieneman is type of safety that I really like. He can play the deep center field, the one high safety, and he can make plays from sideline to sideline. He can play man coverage, he can play zone, he can come down and help stuff the run. One small knock on him was he has a tendency to miss some tackles sometimes, but he is a great rangy safety. Back end can get players in the right spots, and I really like that pick for Chicago's defense, and I think Chicago definitely got better over the last 2 years, from the development of Caleb Williams to last year's draft, new head coach Ben Johnson, now this year's draft. I think Chicago is going to be a team to be reckoned with here for the next several years. Logan Jones, a center out of Iowa. That Iowa has a tendency to produce offensive linemen. They run a same type of zone blocking scheme that Ben Johnson runs with the Lions, so I think that's a good pick. And a corner out of Texas, Malik Muhammad, who also played at University of Washington. A little skinnier than some people like in a corner, but really good ball skills, a little handsy sometimes and grabs receivers, but I like that pick also. He's a good, solid corner. Cincinnati Bengals are next in. They did not have a first-round pick because of a trade with the Giants before the draft, so they got Cassius Howell, a defensive end or an edge player from Texas A&M, who can put pressure on. Colby Young, a wide receiver out of Georgia, who had some issues off the field, but is a good player. And Jack Endries, the tight end from Texas that they got in the 7th round. I think that's a really nice pick. I thought he would go much higher. He's not a great downfield threat, but he is a really solid receiver underneath and could be another option for Joe Burrow. One thing I really did not like, what Cincinnati did not do, is they didn't draft any offensive linemen. Joe Burrow has gotten beaten up his entire career. I really think that they need to invest in the offensive line, get some good quality players, first through fourth round picks where you get your best players, and I really think that that needs to happen for Cincinnati to be a Super Bowl contender. Next, you have the Cleveland Browns. Overall, really, really like their draft. They got a quarterback, wide receiver, and an offensive tackle, all areas of need. They did not draft a guard or a cornerback, according to ESPN, 2 other needs, but a couple of players that they did drafted can play other spots. Start with first-round pick Spencer Fano. He can play either of the guard spots, either of the tackle spots. I think that's a great pick. Excuse me. I really like his athletic ability. Very solid player anywhere along the line. Really nice pick. Then they drafted 2 receivers. Casey Concepcion. I first noticed him when he was playing at North Carolina State. Really electric return man. If he gets out in the open field, he can take it all the way for a touchdown. Great. I really like that pick in the first round, but I even like their second round pick even more. Denzel Boston, wide receiver out of Washington. He is different than most of their other wide receivers. He's 6'3", 6'4", 210, 215 pounds. Really big receiver compared to the rest of the Cleveland receivers, which are all about 5'10", 5'11", about 190, 195 pounds. Now you have a big-bodied receiver on the outside that defenses have to pay attention to. Their next second-round pick, Emmanuel McNeil-Warren out of Toledo. Some people had him as potentially a first-round pick late in the first round. 6'3", 200-pound safety, really big physical guy. Got to see some of his tape. Really like how he plays, physical player. Austin Barber, an offensive tackle out of Florida in the 3rd round. He potentially could play guard or tackle. Parker Brailsford, center for Alabama. Another interior offensive lineman that could help. Just a lot of nice picks. One pick I kind of question is Taylon Green, quarterback out of Arkansas, who's more of an athletic, a Jaden Daniels type of quarterback than more of a pocket type of passer, like a Drew Aller, who Pittsburgh picked up. When I thought that there were maybe some better quarterback options on the board, but I'm not familiar with how their new head coach, Todd Monken, is going to run the quarterback room, so we'll have to see if that's a good fit there. For you Dallas Cowboys fans, they did definitely hit some areas of need. They needed to strengthen their defense, which was definitely a liability last year, and they did that with their first pick, number 11 overall, Caleb Downs. Maybe my favorite player in the draft. He can do it all in the back end. He can get everybody lined up. He can play deep. He can cover wide receivers or tight ends or running backs out of the backfield. He can make tackles at the line of scrimmage. Definitely the rest of the NFC East should take notice. Then their next 2 picks, the end of the 1st round, and then in the 3rd round, they got edge rushers, Malachi Lawrence out of UCF and Jashawn Barham out of Michigan. A lot of people were high on Lawrence, especially late in this draft process. Looking at his tape more, they thought that in the right system, he could really be an effective edge rusher. And Dallas is changing up their system a little bit, going with more of a 3-4 defense than a 4-man line. So I think both of those players could definitely help. And then in the 4th round, who early in the draft process, some people had this player as a potential late 1st rounder. It's LT Overton out of Alabama. I think he's a good, solid player. He's listed as an edge rusher, but I think in a 3-4 scheme, he's more of one of the defensive end types of players. And I think that's a better fit for him, and that's another pick that I do like. Next are the Denver Broncos, and since Denver's my favorite team, I'm going to talk about their roster a little bit more because I'm more familiar with it. A lot of nice picks here. My favorite one is in the 4th round, Jonah Coleman, running back out of Washington. A lot of people had him going no later than middle of the 3rd, so getting him in the 4th round was a nice pick. One thing I like about him is he had 1 fumble in his college career, and even though he's another 5'8", 5'9" running back for the Broncos, I'd like them to have somebody who's a little bit bigger, but he is very thick. He runs about 220, where most of the rest of Denver's back are about 200 pounds. So he's a little bit thicker, and he isn't necessarily one that's going to run 80 yards for a touchdown, but he can get you 40, 50 yards in a run. Nice receiver out of the backfield. Cage Casey, an offensive tackle out of Boise State. I like that pick because both Denver's offensive tackles are getting older. Garrett Bowles is getting better every year, but he is getting older. Mike McGlinchey on the right side, I think he's starting to slip a little bit personally. So I like this pick to have Casey either potentially play inside or take over at the right tackle spot. Denver definitely needed tight end help, and they got 2 of them, Justin Joly and Dallin Bentley. Joly, much more of the receiving tight end. Bentley, bigger. As one of the experts said, he had a little bit more wiggle in his route running. I think they're both nice receiving options, and both could really help Denver's tight end room. I can see Evan Ingram might be reaching the end of his road. He's been in the NFL for about 10 years, and I think these 2 potentially could be 2 other good receiving options. They just need to be better blockers. And Red Murdoch, Mr. Irrelevant in this year's draft, the very last pick of the draft from the University of Buffalo. He set an FBS record with 17 forced fumbles over his career, and watching a lot of his highlights, he doesn't just tackle the man, he tackles the football. He's trying to get that ball every single play. And with this draft pick and with Jonah Ellis, an edge rusher for the Denver Broncos, who they're trying at inside linebacker in some of their mini camps, I think that the writing's on the wall for Drew Sanders, who is a nice player out of Arkansas. And potentially a really good NFL player, but his career has been derailed by injuries. I think that he might be one to go in Denver. Next, you have the Detroit Lions and their first overall pick, Blake Miller, an offensive tackle out of Clemson, definitely a need. 50-plus college starts, a lot of playing time, good experience. Definitely sounds like a Detroit Lions offensive lineman type of player. They got Derek Moore in the second round from Michigan, an edge rusher. They finally got somebody to pair with All-Pro Aiden Hutchinson. And if he can take a little pressure off of Hutchinson, that's really going to help their defense. And they also got another Michigan linebacker, Jimmy Rolder, who a lot of people did like later in this draft process. They got him in the 4th round, and he's going to help their defense also. Next, you have their Green Bay Packers and their corner, Brandon Cisse. That was one of their main concerns. Was when I watch Green Bay games, and living where I do, we get a lot of Green Bay games. Their defensive backs did have a tendency to get picked apart quite a bit. I think that caused a lot of their struggles, so I think that this is a nice pick for them. They eventually got an edge rusher, Danny Dennis Sutton out of Penn State. They got him in the 4th round. I thought that he was going to go much earlier. Real nice player that can help them out now that Micah Parsons, when he comes back from injury, you combine those two, that's going to really create a lot of havoc on the defense. They got a corner to solidify the back end. They did not draft an offensive tackle, guard, or a linebacker, but they did get a player who was a center, Jager Burton from Kentucky, but ESPN notes that he can play just about anywhere along the offensive line. So while they didn't draft a guard, this is a player that could potentially play at a guard position. Next, you have the Houston Texans, who in the 1st round got a guard from Georgia Tech, Keelan Rutledge. A lot of people said that he was one of the more physical guards in the draft, and this is definitely a position of need for the Texans, as their offensive line has been not very good the last couple of years. They added strengthening their defense in Cade McDonald in the 2nd round. He was a Big Ten Defensive Lineman of the Year, and you're adding another stacked piece to a stacked defense. I think that if they can get their offensive line issues figured out, the Texans really can make a push for a deep playoff run this year. They also drafted a guard out of Oklahoma in the 4th round. And one pick that I thought was very interesting was a linebacker out of Indiana, Aiden Fisher. He was a middle linebacker at Indiana in the national championship run. And I read in a couple of different places, both leading up to the draft and after the draft, that he really ran that defense on the field. And it was not uncommon for him to be calling out the other team's plays more than half the time during the course of the game. Smart, instinctive linebacker. He may not necessarily be a 3-down linebacker, but that's the type of guy that you would like on your special teams, or to come in a reserve role if somebody gets hurt or needs to take a few plays off. And I think that him being added to the Houston defense only makes that defense even better, even if he's just in a reserve role. Indianapolis Colts drafted another smart linebacker, C.J. Allen out of Georgia, in the 2nd round. Some people had him going late in the 1st round at one point before Denver traded their picks. But C.J. Allen, really nice pick. He ran the Georgia defense for the last couple of years, and Indianapolis has a knack for finding good interior linebackers and turning them into all pros, and I think he's the next one. They drafted another linebacker later out of Oregon, Bryce, and I'm sorry if I mispronounce this name, Betker out of Oregon, another solid interior linebacker that really does feel that linebacker need. They've lost a couple of players there recently, and I think that's going to strengthen their defense. One thing that I think they should have done, maybe with one of their later round picks, they had 2 picks in the 7th round and 1 late in the 6th, is maybe they should have taken a late round developmental quarterback to pair with Daniel Jones, as he's coming off an Achilles injury. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Next up, we have the Jacksonville Jaguars. A lot of people, a lot of the quote-unquote experts, criticized their draft because their first pick came in the 2nd round. They drafted a tight end who some of the experts didn't have going before the 4th round. but they really liked him. He didn't have a lot of receptions in college, but they wanted a physical blocking type of tight end. But they did draft several players on the line positions. They drafted another tight end out of Houston later in the draft. They got a couple of edge players. They got a Texas A&M defensive tackle, Albert Regis, who can help stuff the run, 6'1", 295 pounds, and Emmanuel Pregnon, a guard from Oregon, who coming into the season was, a lot of people considered him one of the better offensive linemen in the draft. Had a little bit of a rough year, but at 6'4", 341, they had him as the number 3 guard in the draft, according to ESPN, number 47 pick overall, and they got him around pick 90 something. So nice value pick there, and another way to strengthen their line. And another player that I'm going to watch, and I just you're going to see his name in an upcoming podcast also, Zach Durfee out of Washington. He's an edge rusher. He grew up in Southwest Minnesota. Started by looking at playing college basketball, decided to switch to football, tried to walk on at North Dakota State, but they had restrictions due to COVID. So he ended up at the University of Sioux Falls, played there for a few years, and then moved on out to the University of Washington. Kalen DeBoer, now the head coach at Alabama, who took Washington to the national championship game a few years ago. He was from the University of Sioux Falls, so there was that connection there between USF and Washington. And this is a player that I hope makes the roster and is somebody that I'm going to be watching if I have a chance to watch Jacksonville games this year. Next up, we have the Kansas City Chiefs, and as a Broncos fan, as much as it pains me to say, I think the Chiefs had a really nice draft. They traded up for Mansour Delane, who some people had as the number 1 corner in the draft. They got him with the 6th overall pick. And since they lost both of their starting corners this year, one by trade, one by free agency, a necessary pick, they were criticized for trading up to get him from pick number 9 to pick number 6. I don't have a problem with that, since this was definitely a need. They gave up a pick that potentially could have been used on a tight end to replace Travis Kelce, but since Kelce's going to be playing one more year, not necessarily a huge need, but it was a nice pick. Later in the first round, they got Peter Woods out of Clemson, a nice defensive tackle to pair with and learn from Chris Jones, and they envision him eventually taking over for Chris Jones. R. Mason Thomas, an edge rusher out of Oklahoma. Great, just what the Chiefs need is another edge rusher to potentially pressure the quarterback to go along with that defensive tackle in that corner. They got a safety out of Oregon, and I think it was a highly underrated pick, is Emmett Johnson, a running back out of Nebraska. I think he's going to be a great complement to Kenneth Walker III, who they just signed as a free agent out of Seattle. Walker was a hero of the Super Bowl and was a Super Bowl MVP. Great game, and Emmett Johnson, in a way, I think is a poor man's Kenneth Walker. I think he's a real nice player that can fill in. They won't have to change their offense if Kenneth Walker needs a break because he's scoring so many touchdowns or having so many big plays. Johnson can come in a sense, do the same thing. So I think that's a great pick for them. They got a wide receiver out of Cincinnati, Cyrus Allen, who's one of those smaller wide receivers that kind of fits their mold. And a pick that I like that I'm going to talk about more later, and this is where I'm going to criticize several teams, Garrett Nussmeier, a quarterback out of LSU. Prior to the season, some people had him as potentially the first quarterback off the board. He had a real nice season last year at LSU. Everybody expected him to get better, but injuries kind of derailed his season. And in fact, at the NFL Combine, during the medical checks, they actually found that he had a cyst on his spine. So that has been removed. And having the potential number 1 draft pick and definitely a first-round draft pick prior to the season in Nussmeier going in the 7th round to Kansas City. If you're trying to knock Kansas City down another notch, letting them draft a great quarterback late in the 7th round, one of the last 5-6 picks in the draft, that's not the way to do it, especially if you needed a quarterback. So I think that's a great pick. Nussmeier has no pressure. His dad has been a long-time college and NFL coach. He can learn from Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid. And I think that's a great pick. And I think that at some point he might end up as a starter somewhere else in the league. Next up, we have the Los Angeles Chargers. And they address several areas that were obviously of need. Their first round pick, Akeem Mesidor, a little bit of an older player, but an edge rusher, relentless motor. He can move inside and put pressure from the inside if need be. They got center Jake Slaughter out of Florida. He may not necessarily play center for the Chargers. He might play a guard, but they definitely need interior line help. Their offensive line was a disaster last year. And they played, I think 18 games last year, including playoffs, and they had 18 different starting offensive line combinations. Not the way you want to build a team, especially if you have an all-pro quarterback, Justin Herbert. You got an offensive tackle from Memphis to strengthen that offensive line, and then in the 6th round, they drafted 2 more guards, one from Boston College, one from Oregon. So I think that they did what they needed to do to help protect Justin Herbert and improve that offense. Next, you have the Los Angeles Rams. A lot of controversy on their first-round pick, Ty Simpson. I don't have a problem with it because I do believe that other teams would have moved around if Simpson had gotten past the Rams. I don't think that he would have made it out of the first round. I think other teams would have made trades to move up to get him later in the first round. But I do like that pick. If they like him, even though he has limited game experience at the college level, giving him a year or 2 to learn from Matt Stafford and his connection with Sean McVay, I don't have a problem with that pick because at some point Matthew Stafford is going to have to retire and you're going to want somebody who's ready to play. Max Clare, another good tight end that can both block and run routes. He fits the mold of the other 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 tight ends that they have in Los Angeles. They got an offensive tackle out of Missouri who's bounced around but has played in a lot of different systems and is a definite need as they're trying to upgrade their offensive line to protect Matt Stafford. Next, you have the Las Vegas Raiders. Really like their draft. I'm not even going to talk about Fernando Mendoza, the number 1 pick. That has been talked about to death. Traden Stukes, the safety out of Arizona in the 2nd round. Really nice pick there. I like Trey Zune III, a center out of Texas A&M. He can play any of the interior offensive line positions. So they have that flexibility there, especially since they just signed Tyler Lindenbaum, the center from Baltimore as a free agent. Great player to pair with rookie quarterback Mendoza. And then you have Zune, who can play in either of the guard spots next to him. They had some offensive line injury issues last year, so I think their offensive line is better than a lot of people think. And I think that they are going to take a step forward this year. Jermod McCoy, a corner out of Tennessee. Some people had him as the number 1 corner in the draft prior to an injury. ESPN still had him ranked as number 2. He fell all the way to the 4th round because at the end of the 2025 season, he tore his ACL and took a lot of time recovering. They found some other potential knee issues there. But if they got him in the 4th round, potentially arguably some people had him as the best corner in the draft. If he can play 5, 7, 10 years, great pick there. Mike Washington Jr., a running back out of Arkansas. I liked a lot of his tape. He's 6'1", 223. One thing that did bother me a little bit about all the highlights in the film that I saw on him was didn't see a lot of inside runs being 6'1", 223. I think he'd be more of a physical runner, but he seemed like he was more of a speed guy, but still a real nice pick. And they just had a nice, real solid draft, a lot of good quality players that I think will contribute to them. Next, we have the Miami Dolphins with Caden Proctor, offensive tackle out of Alabama. I like that pick. Anytime that all of the NFL scouts and the experts make notes about a player having weight issues, it makes me a little nervous. But he is a very athletic player, type of guy you want first off the bus to scare the other team. Chris Johnson out of San Diego State. Real nice cornerback. I like what he did. as a college player. Some had him as the number 2 or number 3 corner in the draft after McCoy's injury, and he went late in the first round. In the second round, the Dolphins got Jacob Rodriguez, linebacker out of Texas Tech, who won just about every linebacker award you could win. Definitely a leader type and somebody that can change the culture. And you put a player like that under new head coach Jeff Hafley's defense, that's the guy that you want running the defense. A couple other picks I liked. Will Kasmerick, a tight end out of Ohio State. Good, solid tight end, a little underrated with all the wide receivers Ohio State had, but I think that was a nice pick. Chris Bell out of Louisville, I think is going to be a steal where he did. He had a ACL injury late in the season this past year, and he's a little bit bigger receiver at 6'1", 222 pounds, but a nice size receiver. A couple other players that I absolutely loved that they got in back-to-back picks. Kyle Lewis, a linebacker out of Pittsburgh. He's a former safety. He's 6 foot, 220 pounds. Some people had him at about 5'11". I don't care about a player's size. If he can play, he can play. And this guy can play. He can cover backs. He's a little short to cover tight ends, but he's a really good hustler, all-out effort, somebody that will, at absolute worst, will be a contributor on special teams. But I really like him. And one of my favorite players, Michael Teff, if I mispronounce your name. I've never been sure about how to say his name, but he is a safety out of Texas, a former walk-on who ended up as an NFL draft pick. Love the physicality of his game. Seems to be a very smart player. And every time I caught a Texas game, it seemed like he was making a play. But Miami drafted 3 players from Texas, a guard, a safety, and an edge rusher. Another player from Texas Tech, so they dipped into that part of the country for a lot of their talent. They hit all of their needs according to ESPN, a wide receiver, which they got with Bell, a corner they got with Johnson, an edge player they got with Trey Moore from Texas, a tight end with Kasmerick out of Ohio State, and the safety out of Texas. So a real nice draft for them. They had a lot of draft picks. They picked up some picks from Denver in the trade for Jalen Waddle. And I think Bell will help alleviate some of that what they lost with Waddle, but a real nice draft overall. Minnesota Vikings, they got a safety, a center, and a linebacker. They missed out on a wide receiver and a guard. However, not crazy about their first-round pick. Caleb Banks out of Florida. 6'6", 325. Great defensive tackle when he's healthy. He only played 90 plays this past year due to a foot injury, and then at the combine they discovered a second injury for him. They say he's going to be ready for training camp. However, with big men like that, multiple foot injuries, that would make me very nervous, especially when you have a major need at safety. You have a potential Hall of Famer retiring in Harrison Smith, and you could have had his heir apparent, the 1B version of Harrison Smith, in Dylan Thieneman, who went a few picks later, and you're going to see him for the next 10 years with the Chicago Bears. Thieneman, his game, the first thing I thought of when I was watching him play is he's exactly like Harrison Smith. About every mock draft you could go out and find had Thieneman to the Minnesota Vikings, and they passed on him. So I think that was a mistake. They got Banks, who's a very nice defensive tackle, don't get me wrong, but they could have gotten other defensive tackles later in the draft. Second round, they got Jake Golday out of Cincinnati. Some people thought he was a little bit stiff as a linebacker, but I like the pick. Minnesota then in the third round got Dominique Orange out of Iowa State, a defensive tackle, who was nicknamed Big Citrus because he's 6'2", 322 pounds. So now Minnesota has 2 325-pounders in the middle of their defensive line, which is great, but can they get pressure on the quarterback? They got Caleb Tiernan, an offensive tackle out of Northwestern, who potentially could move inside to guard. Then they finally got a safety, Jacoby Thomas out of Miami, who's a nice player, don't get me wrong, but I thought Thieneman was special. I thought he was better. And I think that would have been a better pick in the first round for Minnesota. And so they did make some nice picks, but I think Minnesota whiffed on their first one. Next, you have the Patriots, Caleb Lomu, an offensive tackle out of Utah. Remember watching the Super Bowl, and I was thinking two things about the Super Bowl is that whoever lost the game, it was going to be determined by their offensive line. New England had two rookies as their left guard and left tackle, and Seattle had a right guard who it seemed like every time New England got pressure, that's where they attacked. Well, Lomu can fill a position of need. He can maybe play right tackle if the Patriots wanted to keep Will Campbell at left tackle. But he's definitely an offensive tackle. If they wanted to have Campbell switch sides, that's potentially an option there with Lomu. Gabe Jacobs, an edge player out of Illinois. Didn't know a lot about him, but he was rising up the ranks late in the draft process. He was very effective for Illinois and a very nice player from everything that I read. A nice second-round pick that I think could be a little bit underrated. Later in the draft, in the 7th round, the Patriots got a couple of picks. Baron Morton, quarterback out of Texas Tech. Nice player, good developmental prospect. And then a few picks later, they got Jam Miller, a running back out of Alabama. A little bit on the small side for running back. And he seemed to like, when I got to watch Alabama games, he wanted to take everything outside, even though he seemed to be very physical. 5'10", 209. He has good speed to the outside, but he was another player that seemed to always be banged up. And I always was thinking that he should be producing more, but a very nice pick in the 7th round that could contribute. The Saints, Jordan Tyson out of Arizona State was their first round pick. A lot of people had him as the number 1 wide receiver of the draft. I wasn't as high on him because he had a lot of injuries in college. And you'll hear it said a lot of times, your best ability in the NFL is your availability. So he's not on the field, he's not going to help. You got a defensive tackle from Georgia. And then one of my favorite college players, Oscar Delp out of Georgia. Everyone knocked his production out of Georgia, where his first year he had the most receptions of his career. But their offense wasn't necessarily geared to go through the tight end. Yes, they had Brock Bowers, but Brock Bowers was a first-round draft pick. Some people had him going as high as 6th in the draft a couple of years ago. So Delp, I think, is a real nice pick. I think he's a better blocker than receiver, but I think he's an underrated receiver, and I think he's going to be a nice fit for that offense. You got Bryce Lance, brother of Trey Lance from North Dakota State. Good-sized receiver, 6'3", 6'4", 205 pounds. Maybe a little bit of a developmental prospect, but a nice big receiver that potentially could help them. Had a real nice 40 time, so he's got some speed to challenge the defense. And then Lorenzo Styles Jr., a safety out of Ohio State. His brother Sonny Styles went 7th overall. A nice solid pick, and I think that he'll make the team, if not as a starter, definitely as a special teams player and a backup. The New York Giants. A lot of people criticize their draft. John Harbaugh's first draft with the Giants. They passed on safety Caleb Downs out of Ohio State. Maybe a bit of an issue. But their first pick, Arvell Reese out of Ohio State. I think he's a do-it-all linebacker. A lot of people had him tagged as an edge rusher, but I would rather have somebody that could play an outside linebacker, one play, bump up and be in the edge. On the next play, then be back like he's going to drop into coverage and blitz, threaten the line like he's going to blitz and drop back into coverage. I think he's a more versatile player than some of the other linebackers in the draft, and I really like that pick. The 10th pick, Francis Mauigoa, out of an offensive tackle out of Miami. A lot of people said this is where they should have drafted Caleb Downs. I'm not sure. I think maybe that might have been the better way to go, but John Harbaugh is about physical football, and this guy is a very, very physical football player. They got a corner out of Tennessee, Colton Hood, who some people had him better than his teammate McCoy coming out of Tennessee. Giants got him in the 2nd round. They got a nice wide receiver with Malachi Fields out of Notre Dame in the 3rd round. And I think that the Giants have potential for a really dynamic offense. You have Jackson Dart at quarterback, Cam Scatterbo at running back when he recovers from his injury. They have a running back, I believe his name, last name was Tracy, who is a nice, solid running back with the Giants also. So now you have 2 running backs back there. You have wide receiver Malik Neighbors coming back from an ACL injury. Now you have Fields. You have Darius Slayton, who is a receiver. So you have a nice variety of wide receivers. They have some real solid tight ends that are good blockers and good enough receivers to threaten the middle of the field. I think the Giants' offense is going to be better this year. Maybe would have liked to see them get a little bit more physical in the offensive line, but definitely I think that they are headed in the right direction as far as challenging in the NFC East. Next, we have the Jets. And everybody's saying that they had a really nice draft. I agree. I have one little criticism of them, but we'll get into that later. But they hit all of their needs. They got a quarterback, wide receiver, an edge rusher, a guard, and a corner. David Bailey, the number 2 pick in the draft, led the FBS with sacks. I think that's a good pick. I maybe would have gone with Arvell Reese just because of Reese's versatility. But if this guy turns into a terror as an edge rusher, you can't argue with that. Kenyon Sadiq, the unanimous number 1 tight end in the draft, great pick there. And then later in the 1st round, they got Omar Cooper Jr., a wide receiver out of Indiana. Again, an Indiana player coming off a national championship. Nice wide receiver. And there you have back-to-back good offensive pieces to go with Breece Hall, your running back. So it doesn't matter who the quarterback is, but it looks like right now it's going to be Geno Smith. Now he has some targets to work with. Then in the 2nd round, they got D'Angelo Pounds, a corner from Indiana. It was tagged as a nickel corner because he's smaller, 5'8", 182. He does not play like that. I love his play. It's hard to find an Indiana game where he is not making a big stop on 3rd down, an interception, forcing a fumble, a big hit. He plays so much bigger than his 5'8", 188 or 182. He plays more like he's 6'1", 6'2", 200 pounds. He can hit hard. Definitely one of the better players in the draft, in my opinion. In the 4th round, they got a quarterback, Cade Klubnik, out of Clemson. Early in his college career, a lot of people saw him as a potential number 1 overall draft pick. Last couple of years, he's really struggled. Potentially, I think this could be a real nice pick for them if he can develop, and if they can develop him, even though the Jets have not shown they can develop quarterbacks in the past, such as Sam Darnold and Zach Wilson, and the list goes on and on and on. But if the new regime can develop him and potentially have their quarterback of the future, next year's draft, which is a quarterback-heavy draft, maybe they can work one of those number 1 picks. I think they have 3 of them next year into more picks and more players. And then later in the draft, in the 6th round, they got a guard. In the 7th, they got a safety. It said that the Jets really like the safety, VJ Payne, out of Kansas State, 6'3", 206 pounds. A lot of starting experience for him, which I think was a nice pick, but potentially they have quarterback issues. Maybe they're one of the teams that could have taken Garrett Nussmeier in the 7th round. Eagles continue to add playmakers for Jalen Hurts. 1st round pick, Mekhi Lemon, one of my favorite receivers in the draft, followed by Eli Stowers, everybody's number 2 tight end in the drafts. Stowers needs to be more physical as a blocker, but he's going to be the heir apparent to Dallas Goedert, I believe. They got some offensive linemen. Cole Payton, the quarterback from North Dakota State, in the 5th round. Little confused on that pick, but the more I read about it, they say that he has a similar style to Jalen Hurts, even though he's a left-handed quarterback. But if he plays similar to Jalen Hurts, well, then that might be a type of player that they can develop and maybe use in various situations to give Jalen Hurts a bit of a break in a goal line situation, a tush push, save his body a little bit. Cole Wisniewski, a safety out of Texas Tech, late in the 7th round, 6'4", 220-pound safety. Maybe could move him to linebacker or a dime linebacker in passing situations with his size. And then Ua Bernard, 6'4", 306-pound defensive tackle from Nigeria. So he's 6'4", 306 pounds, and ran a 4.640. All of his testing at the International Pro Day in Africa was similar to the testing that Myles Garrett had when he was at the combine coming out of college. Myles Garrett, who just set the NFL single season sack record, Defensive Player of the Year, probably the best pass rusher in the game right now. And you just drafted a defensive tackle that's similar to him. So even though he's a developmental player, it's definitely a nice pick in the 7th round. Pittsburgh then at the 21st pick in the draft, right behind the Eagles. Pittsburgh was expected to draft Malachi Lemon. The Eagles got him first, so they went with an offensive tackle out of Arizona State who could potentially play. Jeremy Bernard, a wide receiver out of Alabama. I really like Bernard's game. I think he's going to be a nice complement to DK Metcalf. And the name just escapes me. Wide receiver that they signed from, Michael Pittman Jr., signed from the Colts. Bernard is a similar type of player, 6'1", 206 pounds, a little bit smaller than Metcalf and Pierce, but another big body receiver. In the 3rd round, they got Drew Aller, quarterback out of Penn State. I really like Aller's game, but I think it's kind of interesting that for the last several years, Penn State has gotten these really good college quarterbacks, but they can't make it in the NFL. Is it a developmental issue at Penn State? Might be, but I liked Aller's game. I think he's a good complement for Mike McCarthy's offense. Next, we have Jennings Dunker, who became an internet sensation with his mullet and all of that, an offensive tackle out of Iowa. Now, this is what I'm talking about as far as ESPN needs and players not necessarily fitting what ESPN says. So Pittsburgh had needs of quarterback, guard, offensive tackle, safety, and defensive tackle. Well, Pittsburgh got an offensive tackle with their first pick. And then in the 3rd round, they got Jennings Dunker, an offensive tackle out of Iowa. But many people had him moving as to a guard in the pros. And he's that type of player. Mike McCarthy runs that zone type of blocking scheme similar to Iowa's. So if he can move in and be an offensive guard, Pittsburgh hit all their needs. They get an offensive lineman out of Iowa, which those guys are all over the NFL. So a really nice pick there. And then in the 4th round, they got another Iowa player, Caden Wetjen, a wide receiver. Now, he's a smaller wide receiver. He's 5'9", 195 approximately. He's smaller than most of the rest of the Pittsburgh receivers. Most of the rest of the Steelers receivers are 6'1" or taller. Several of them are 6'3" and 6'4". Wetjen is 5'9". He's more of a slot type of receiver, but he's a dynamic return man. He had several punt and kickoff returns for touchdowns in college, kind of a gadget play type of guy, but definitely somebody that can flip the field, and I think he'll be more of the special teams type of player, especially being drafted in the 4th round for the Steelers. Riley Nowakowski, another Indiana player, a tight end / fullback type of player Mike McCarthy will definitely use in his offense, a real nice player who I thought was underrated. But a lot of really good draft picks in Pittsburgh. I think depending on what their quarterback situation is with Aaron Rodgers and what's going on there. Outside of that, I think they had a really good draft and are set up for success. Seattle, hard to argue with what they did in the draft. They originally, I think, only had like 3 or 4 picks based on previous trades, but they got who a lot of people said was the number 2 running back in the draft, who was also the number 2 running back at Notre Dame, Jadarian Price. He was the backup to the number 3 overall pick, Jeremiah Love in Notre Dame. A lot of people said he could have been the starter just about anywhere else in the country. So a great pick at number 32, especially after losing Super Bowl MVP Kenneth Walker in free agency. The safety Bud Clark out of TCU in the 2nd round. I'm kind of surprised Clark made it all the way through the 2nd round. Real nice safety. Playmaker all over the field, 6'1", 188. A little on the small side for a safety weight-wise, but he can play all over the field. They got a guard out of Iowa, Bo Stevens. I think he's immediately going to compete for the right guard position. As I mentioned earlier when I was talking about New England, I thought Seattle's right guard was the weak spot in their offensive line, which they had a really good offensive line, so that's not a knock on that right guard, but I think that Stevens could come in and play that position in that offense that they run. They didn't need a lot of other positions. They got a safety after they lost their safeties in draft. But overall, a real nice draft for the defending Super Bowl champions that I think will keep them in contention for the next couple of years. San Francisco now. They didn't get a center or a safety that ESPN had as one of their needs. And a lot of people criticize their draft. But John Lynch and Kyle Shanahan, they don't always listen to the people outside the building. They want what they want. They know what they like. Not terribly familiar with Deshaun Stribling, the wide receiver they got out of Ole Miss, but 6'2", 207. But everything that I've read is that he's a yards after catch guy, which is a staple of the Shanahan offense. The third round pick, the third running back off the board was Kalen Black, running back from Indiana, 5'10", 210. And a lot of people criticized him. They had him as a day 3 pick at best, not a great receiver out of the backfield, blah, 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 not super fast. But I believe I was watching the Big Ten championship game, and Black made a run that reminded me of another former Shanahan back. Not Kyle's, but a running back Mike Shanahan in Denver, a guy by the name of Trell Davis. And Black made a run that it just, the way he ran it, hard physical nature, right up the middle, there's just something about that run that made me think, oh my goodness, that's TD, that's Trell Davis. Not saying that Black is going to be a Hall of Famer, but that's the type of back for that Shanahan system, for that West Coast offense. So I think that's a much better pick than a lot of people are thinking it is. And if you look at their measurables, Black is almost the same size and weight as Davis was. Black's just a hair shorter and a little bit heavier. But that's the type of back that works well in that Shanahan offense, and I think that's a really nice pick. Next, you have the Buccaneers, who got Reuben Bain, who a lot of people had as a number 2 edge rusher in the draft, all the way down at the 15th pick in the draft. Great pick, and I think he's going to play with a little bit of a chip on his shoulder about falling all the way to 15 when a lot of people had him as a top 10 pick. Real nice pick there, and I think he's really going to help Tampa's defense. Ted Hurst, a wide receiver out of Georgia State, long, rangy receiver. Keontae Scott, a corner out of Miami, who I think was a solid corner there also. So a nice draft by Tampa. Not a great draft, but their second pick was Josiah Trotter, linebacker out of Missouri. He's going to be replacing Levante David, who's going to be a Hall of Famer. Big shoes to fill, but it'll be interesting to see how well he fills them. Next up, we have Tennessee. Titans drafting early because they've been down for a few years under new coach Robert Saleh. I think that they had a really good draft. Carnell Tate, they now have a wide receiver for Cam Ward. Keldrick Falk, an edge rusher out of Auburn. He didn't have a lot of production in college, but the coaches that he played against said that he's underrated. Might be more of an interior fit in pass rushing situations, but a nice player. Anthony Hill Jr., a linebacker out of Texas. He made plays all over the field. Some people, as recently as a month before the draft, had him as a late first-round pick. They got him later in the second round. A good, solid pick. One of my favorite running backs to watch in college, Nick Singleton out of Penn State. He lasted till late in the 5th round. I thought he would go much earlier. I think that's a nice pickup for the Titans. Now you have Cam Ward. You have a couple other backs there. Now Singleton. Now Carnell Tate. A couple of other young receivers. So they have what is starting to be the makings of a real nice offense. They got a guard out of Arkansas, but a pick that excited me was in the 6th round. They got Pat Coogan, the center out of Indiana. A center. He was the Rose Bowl MVP this past year. There hasn't been a Rose Bowl MVP in, I think it was something like 80 years. Smart player. I love smart centers. I don't care if he's not as big and physical as what some people think guards should be, but he can play center, potentially could play guard, a leader coming off a national championship. And I love a smart center with a young quarterback, even if the center is young. So Coogan pairing with Cam Ward, I think, could be a nice pairing and would help in development of both players. And the Washington Commanders, we're going to end with them. Their first pick, Sonny Styles, who started out as a safety, which I liked him because with that safety background, he has good coverage skills for a linebacker, big physical man in the middle of that defense. And then later in the draft, they got Nick Singleton's running mate from Penn State, Katron Allen. They got him in the 6th round, which I thought was crazy that he was still available there. A lot of people said Washington needed to add to the running back room. They obviously did with a good, solid player. He can go 70 yards for a touchdown. He can block. He can catch the ball out of the backfield. Nice add to their offense to help Jalen Daniels and their running back stable. They have a bunch of different running backs. None of them is really great, but all of them are very effective. And I think that's what Allen will contribute to that Washington offense. And in the 7th pick, or in the 7th round, their pick, they drafted a quarterback out of Rutgers. Washington did. Nice pick. But getting back to something that I mentioned before, Garrett Nussmeier, drafted in the 7th round by the Chiefs. Potentially 1st round quarterback. Most teams had him, most people had him as the number 3 or 4 quarterback in the entire draft. He lasts till the last 5, 6, 7 picks of the draft in the 7th round where Kansas City scoops him up. If you are one of the following teams, Pittsburgh, Minnesota, the Jets, the Cardinals, the Dolphins, who needed a developmental quarterback, the Browns, Indianapolis, somebody behind Daniel Jones, Las Vegas may be doubling up. Even though you got Fernando Mendoza, maybe draft another one. Minnesota, Carolina, get somebody back up, Bryce Young. Why not spend a 7th round pick on a guy who is potentially a 1st round draft pick? Yes, he had some injury issues. A lot of defensive coordinators thought that he was one of the better quarterbacks in the draft, at least a lot of the college defensive coordinators. So if you're a quarterback needy team, why did you not take a chance on a 7th round pick on a guy who is one of the better quarterbacks coming out of college, who was one of the better quarterbacks going into this past season, even though he had some injury issues, and LSU wasn't as good as expected. They fired their head coach midway through the season. Take a chance on him. And instead he goes to Kansas City, somebody that doesn't need a quarterback necessarily, but if he develops and becomes a good backup for Patrick Mahomes, they have Justin Fields right now as their primary backup. Nussmeier can just sit and learn and soak everything in. His dad is a longtime college coach and has spent time in the NFL. He knows, if he doesn't know, he'll learn very quickly how to study, how to plan. He'll learn this offense. That would have been a guy that a lot of these teams should have taken in the 7th round and didn't. But these are just some of my thoughts and opinions on the 2026 NFL Draft. Again, players I like, players I didn't. Hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button, and we'll see you on our next episode.